The prairie around Sable Creek, Colorado, did not care what a person was worth. It bloomed in spring regardless, its grasses going green and then gold, its wildflowers opening along the fence lines and the creek banks and the low places where water sat a week longer than everywhere else. Lavender and prairie clover and yellow coneflower, the kind of abundance that costs nothing and is therefore valued by people who can afford to value things that cost nothing. Lena Whitlow was one of those people. She had grown up on a narrow claim at the edge of the open range, the daughter of a homesteader who had loved the land more than it had loved him back, and who had died owing more than he owned but less than he'd borrowed, which was a kind of honesty she'd inherited along with the house and the garden and the fence line he'd built with his own hands before they got too stiff to work properly. She was 28. She grew what she could, sold at the weekly market, mended and sewed and made tinctures from the dried plants she gathered, and she got by. Getting by in that country in that decade was not a small thing. The morning Claudia Fairbourne walked past her market table was a Saturday in late June, when the heat came down like a weight, and the dust from the road settled over everything, including the bundles of lavender and the embroidered handkerchiefs and the small tin of calendula salve that Lena had stayed up past midnight to finish. Claudia Fairbourne was 19, clean-gloved, and certain of her position in the way that daughters of wealthy men sometimes are before the world has had occasion to complicate their certainties. She picked up one of Lena's lavender bundles, turned it in her fingers as though evaluating something she was considering being generous about, and set it back down. "You still sell things that grow on their own and call it work," she said. Lena said nothing. She had been saying nothing to Claudia Fairbourne for the better part of 2 years, and had developed a certain fluency with it. At the edge of the market, near the livery stable, a man was working on a bridle strap. He'd arrived in Sable Creek 3 days ago, asked for work, been given a meal and the use of the tack room in exchange for a week's worth of small repairs. He had no horse of his own. His coat had been through several winters. He worked steadily, without apparent distress about any of it. Claudia looked at him, then at Lena, and her expression completed the math before her mouth did. "So it's true, then," she said, loudly enough for the surrounding stalls to hear. "You chose that one." She let the pause land. A poor girl picking a man poorer than herself. That's a kind of romance, I suppose. You can live on wildflowers and good intentions when the roof comes down. The laughter was not mean at its core, just opportunistic, the kind that rushes in when someone creates the space for it. Lena's hand tightened on the basket handle. She looked at Claudia with the direct, composed attention of someone who has decided not to perform distress for an audience. "My land is my home," Lena said. Claudia's smile did not widen so much as clarify. "For now," she said. That afternoon, the notice went up on the post outside the land office. The Whitlow claim, situated on the southern border of the Fairbourne Range, was subject to a boundary dispute filed by Edwin Fairbourne. A fee for verification and any additional taxes arising from the survey would be due within 60 days. If not paid, the property would be subject to auction under the county debt provision. Lena read the notice 3 times. The numbers on it were not numbers she had. Miles Arden, who was still working on the bridle strap when she walked back past the livery, watched her face and said nothing. He was not in the habit of saying things before he understood what was needed. She stopped. "It's the land," she said. "I saw the notice. I can't pay it." Miles set down the strap. He looked at the land office from across the street, then at her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll go with you." Lena looked at his coat, at his boots, worn through at the heel and resoled with leather that was already starting to crack. She did not say, "You have nothing to offer." She said, "They'll laugh at you." "They already laughed," he said. "Didn't slow me down much." Now, Miles Arden had been a good many things before he arrived in Sable Creek, but poor had not been one of them for very long. He had been poor for exactly 6 weeks, which was the duration of his experiment in finding out whether a man stripped of his name and his accounts and his family's association could tell anything real about the world and the people in it. He was 29 years old. He was the inheritor of a railroad interest, a bank arrangement, and approximately 14,000 acres of land distributed across 3 counties. He had never wanted any of it particularly. He had wanted to know what people were like when they didn't know who he was. He had wanted specifically to know whether anyone would see him rather than the Arden name. He had been finding this out with some success until Lena. With Lena, the experiment had gotten complicated in the way experiments do when you find the answer, but the answer reveals a problem with the method. He had met her at the market his second day in town. She'd been selling the lavender. He'd had nothing to buy it with, which he'd mentioned honestly, and she'd given him a small bundle anyway and said it kept the flies off in a tent or a small room, which was practical information delivered without condescension. He had been, in the way of a man unused to being given things without conditions, extremely affected by this. They had talked at the market each Saturday. He had fixed the broken latch on her gate because it was the only material thing he had to offer. She had brought him supper once, when she saw him eating cold bread at the well, and had sat on the well coping and talked to him about her father's garden as though he were someone worth talking to. In those first weeks, Miles had learned things about Lena by watching how she worked. She knew the names of every plant she tended, not their common names, but their properties, what they kept away, what they drew in, what they were good for in winter, and what they needed to be harvested before the first frost, or they'd be worth nothing. She knew the weather by the way the lavender moved an hour before the change came. She could price her market goods to the penny and still make room for Tommy Reed from the livery, who was 14 and had no money but liked to smell the herbs. And she let him smell them without making it into something he'd have to feel grateful about. He had understood before the second week that something had happened. He had not yet found a way to address what that meant in light of what he hadn't told her. He had written the letter to Gideon on the 3rd week. He had sent it from the county seat so it wouldn't have a Sable Creek postmark. He had told himself it was for information only, a precaution, preparation in case things became more complicated than he'd anticipated. He had not told himself the truth about why he was writing, which was that he had already decided he was not leaving. He worked at the livery. He took other small jobs as they came, a fence repair here, a day's labor at the grain store there. He was not good at having nothing to do, and found that useful work was about as close to contentment as he'd come in recent memory. He ate his meals from what he earned and slept in the tack room on a cot he'd rebuilt from a broken frame he found in the alley behind the feed store, and he thought about Lena and the lavender field every morning when he woke up, which was not something he'd expected to be thinking about. She had never asked him where he came from. She had not asked because it was clear he was not ready to say, and she was not in the habit of forcing people to speak before they were ready. He had noticed this and was grateful for it and also unsettled by it in the way that generosity unsettles a person who hasn't experienced much of it. One evening she had brought him supper at the livery, unexpected, and sat on the fence rail while he ate, and told him about her father planting the lavender the spring he knew he was dying. "He wanted to leave me something that would keep coming back," she said. "He knew the house needed work and the debt was bad, but lavender grows on its own. He said it was a gift that didn't need his hands to keep giving." She looked at the darkening sky. "I think about that a lot. What it means to leave something that doesn't need you to tend it." Miles had finished his supper and said nothing for a while. "He was right," he said finally. "That's the kind of thing that lasts." She had looked at him then with the particular steady attention she gave to things that mattered to her. "You're a better man than you let people think," she said. He had wanted to say something honest and had not been able to find the words before she picked up her basket and went home. The 60 days passed with the particular speed of time running out on something you cannot stop. Lena had sold everything that could be sold without gutting the ability to start over. The last of the dried herbs, the quilt her mother had pieced, the 2 young chickens she'd meant to keep through winter. She was short by an amount that looked small on paper and was enormous in reality. Miles spent his evenings during this period in ways that Lena did not fully see. He went to the land office and examined the boundary records, which were public documents, and found that the line Edwin Fairbourne was disputing had been established by survey in 1876 and had not changed. He wrote a letter, which he sent through the county seat, to a man named Gideon Shaw, whose name he had not used in 6 weeks, and whose response would, he understood, require him to stop pretending. He also sat outside Lena's fence some evenings when the light was going, because he could see the lamp in her kitchen window, and it meant she was still working, and he thought that if he was close enough, he might be some small use if anything was needed, though he never knocked. The evening before the auction, he left a box at her gate. Inside was everything she had given him in the past 6 weeks. The lavender bundle, a piece of embroidered cloth she had pressed on him on a cold morning, a handkerchief she'd mended without being asked. Underneath these things he had placed a folded piece of paper. He wrote, "Wherever tomorrow goes, I'll stand with you." He did not sign it with either name because he wasn't sure yet which one was true. Lena found it at dawn. She read it twice. She did not open the gate. The auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock before the land office, which had a wide front step that functioned as an informal public platform. Sable Creek turned out for it the way it turned out for most things that promised resolution. Edwin Fairbourne arrived early, in his good coat, with Claudia beside him and a hired attorney behind. The county recorder stood at the table with his papers. Lena arrived alone, in the dress she wore to the market, with her father's land deed rolled in her coat pocket. She had kept it there for 3 weeks because holding it sometimes made her feel more certain. The recorder called the proceeding to order. He had reached the point of reading the disputed amount when a carriage stopped on the main street. Not a local carriage, a black one, city-built, with a driver and a second man who descended before it had fully stopped. The second man was Gideon Shaw, 70 years old, with a lawyer's case under one arm and the kind of expression that comes from decades of settling things definitively. He crossed the street without looking at the crowd, went directly to the recorder's table, and laid a set of documents down. Behind him, Miles stepped out of the carriage. He was wearing different clothes. The coat was clean and good quality. The boots were whole. He looked like the same man, and he did not, and the crowd understood both things simultaneously. The recorder looked at the documents Gideon had placed on the table, then looked up at the crowd, then looked back down at the documents with the expression of someone who has just been handed a problem larger than the one he woke up anticipating. Gideon said, quietly and precisely, that the Arden family, whose name appeared on 3 agreements Edwin Fairbourne had cited as the basis for his boundary claim, had not authorized any such agreements, that the agreements were fabrications bearing forged association with the Arden interest, that the fees Edwin Fairbourne had assessed against the Whitlow claim based on those agreements were therefore without legal standing, and that Miles Arden, present and identified, could provide documentation of all of the above. Edwin Fairbourne's attorney said several things in succession. None of them helped. Claudia was very still. Miles was not looking at either of them. He was looking at Lena, who was standing at the edge of the gathering with her father's deed in her hand and an expression he could not read, which was worse than one he could. The recorder took the documents. He consulted with Fairbourne's attorney. The consultation was brief. The boundary claim was suspended pending review. The fee schedule was voided. The auction was not held. Claudia found her voice before her father did. "Well," she said, "it seems you chose better than you knew." She said it at Lena, but loudly. There was calculation in it. The implication was that Lena had won because of who Miles was, not because she was right. Miles turned. "She chose what she could see," he said. He said it quietly, but in the way that quiet things carry when a crowd is listening for them. "She chose it before I told her my name. You're in the habit of waiting until you know the name." He looked at Claudia with no anger and no heat, just the level observation of someone reporting a fact. "That's why you're standing where you are, and she's standing where she is." Claudia did not answer that. The crowd had things to say about Edwin Fairbourne. Several of them had been waiting to say them for some time. An older farmer named Dale Hess said that Fairbourne had pressured him to sell grazing rights by threatening his water access. A woman named Cora Bell said she'd sold her family's back quarter at a loss because Fairbourne had made it clear her other options were worse. Each account had the particular weight of something carried a long time before being set down. Miles listened to all of it. He said very little. He was watching Lena, who had moved to the edge of the market square and was standing with her arms crossed, not looking at him. After the crowd had dispersed enough to breathe in, he walked to where she was. She looked at him for a long time without saying anything. "I know," he said. "What do you know? That you're angry, that you have the right to be." He stopped. "That I was wrong not to tell you." "You let me think I was choosing someone the town laughed at," Lena said, "when I was actually the only one who couldn't see the joke." "You weren't the joke. I was the last person to know the truth about the man I." She stopped, straightened. "That's not a small thing, Miles." "No," he said, "it's not." He did not make an argument. He stood with both hands at his sides and let her look at him. "I wanted to know," he said finally, "if anyone would see me before they heard who I was. I found out." His voice changed slightly. "I found out in a way that wasn't fair to you." Lena looked at the lavender field at the edge of the market square, the wild plants growing between the fence rails, unasked for, unremarkable, exactly what they were. "Go home," she said. "Not the Arden house, not the carriage. Go back to the tack room and work the bridle repair you started Tuesday, and I'll bring you supper when I'm ready to talk." He went. The following weeks were not simple. Lena was not a woman who moved quickly from hurt to forgiveness because the alternative had proven profitable. She was a woman who took stock of things as they were, which was both her strength and the thing that made her take longer. Miles went back to the tack room. He did not resume the Arden name in Sable Creek except as required by the legal proceedings against Fairbourne. He fixed the bridle. He fixed 3 other bridles and a saddle tree and the hinge on the feed-room door. He ate what he was given and did not order from town. Gideon Shaw shook his head at this and said he was making things unnecessarily difficult. Miles said the difficulty was already made and he was working on deserving to come out of it. Lena brought supper on the 4th evening. She sat on the step and he sat on the tack chest, and they ate without talking much. When they had finished, she set down her bowl and said, "You wanted to be seen before you were named. I understand that. I even understand why." She looked at her hands. "But you could have told me after the first week, after the second. You could have trusted me with it." "I could have," he said. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "That it would change how you looked at me." Lena was quiet for a while. "It did change how I look at you," she said, "but not because you're rich. Because you didn't think I could be trusted to look the same." He let that settle. "You're right," he said. They sat in the tack room with the evening coming through the high window and the smell of leather and hay and the particular dry warmth of a summer ending. "I'll need time," Lena said. "I have it," he said. It was autumn before she came back to the fence. The late prairie flowers were finishing, the grasses going to brown and gold, the sky that particular clear blue that Colorado gets in October when the summer has finally stopped arguing. Miles had spent the weeks making himself useful in ways that had nothing to do with money. He had repaired the well coping she'd been putting off. He had restrung the fence line on the west side where the posts had heaved with last year's frost. He had spent an afternoon with Lena's neighbor, an old man named Fletcher, helping to clear a blocked drainage ditch in exchange for nothing except the time. He had done these things the way he did things, quietly, without making them into announcements. Lena had watched all of it from the kitchen window or from the garden or from the porch, and she had been making her own accounting. She came to the fence on a Friday with a braid of dried grasses that she'd made while thinking, which was something she'd done since childhood. He came to the fence from the other side. She held out the braid. He took it. "I'm not forgiving you because you're rich," she said, "and I'm not staying because you can protect the land." He waited. "I'm staying," she said, "because for 3 weeks you slept in a tack room and fixed things that needed fixing and ate cold bread at the well, and you never looked once like you were keeping track of what you were owed for it." She put her hand on the fence rail between them. "That's the man I chose. I just need to know he's still here." "He is," Miles said. "He's the only one that was ever real." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the ring. He had ordered it from the jeweler in Denver, silver, simple, with a small carved branch of prairie lavender on the face, because it was the thing she'd handed him freely before she had any reason to. She looked at it. "I'm not marrying Miles Arden the heir," she said. "I know. I'm marrying the man who fixed my fence and brought back the lavender." "Same man," he said, "just better dressed." She laughed. She took the ring. Edwin Fairbourne's affairs were reviewed over the following months. 3 families received restitution for boundary fees improperly assessed. A 4th received an extension on land payments that should never have been pressured in the first place. Gideon Shaw was quietly thorough about all of it. Miles did not hold a public proceeding. He simply made sure the records were corrected and the people who had been wronged were told. The town of Sable Creek did what towns do when they find out they have misjudged something. They adjusted, with varying degrees of grace. Some people came to Lena directly. Cora Bell from the fabric shop said she should have spoken up sooner, and she'd been carrying that. Lena received this without making it easier or harder than it was. She said only, next time someone's standing alone in a place they shouldn't have to stand alone, don't wait for it to be settled before you decide whose side to be on. The wedding was held on the property, outside, between the fence and the lavender field, because Lena had not fought to keep the land only to celebrate somewhere else. Miles wore his good clothes and his old boots, the ones he'd worn to Sable Creek, because Lena had polished them and set them outside his door the morning of, and he understood what that meant. She wore her market dress and flowers in her hair, and they stood under the wide Colorado sky with enough witnesses to fill the field, including Tommy from the livery, who had been kind to Miles when Miles had nothing to show for it, and Fletcher from next door, who brought preserves as a wedding gift and cried at the ceremony without apparent embarrassment. Miles kissed her once, with the particular care of a man who knows he has been given something worth being careful with. After, they walked back through the lavender together. The grasses were going gold across the range. Somewhere past the ridge the cattle were coming down from summer pasture. Smoke was rising from the neighbor's chimney and from their own. Lena looked at the fence her father had built, and the fence Miles had mended, and the house that would hold them both through winter. "No more secrets," she said. "No more secrets," he said. He meant it. She believed him. These are 2 different things that in time became one. There are people who are seen for what they own and people who are seen for what they are, and these 2 categories rarely overlap in a room where everyone is paying attention to names. But on the margin of things, in small markets and tack rooms and the places where work gets done quietly, sometimes a person gets seen before they get named. That is a rare gift, and the only honest way to receive it is to become, fully and at last, the person who was seen. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.